When Eleanor Hart arrived at Blackthorn Cove, she had not intended to stay longer than a week. The small coastal town, wrapped in silver fog and shadowed by jagged cliffs, was meant to be nothing more than a retreat from the noise of London and the bitter remains of a failed marriage. She rented a weather-worn cottage perched above the sea, where salt clung to the windows and the cries of distant gulls pierced the silence. Each morning, she walked alone along the deserted shoreline, her boots sinking into damp sand as restless waves whispered against the shore. It was on the third morning that she noticed them. Footprints. Bare human footprints, large and distinct, appearing in the wet sand ahead of her. They emerged from nowhere, beginning far beyond the reach of the tide, as though someone had simply stepped out of thin air. Eleanor paused, her breath caught in her throat. The tracks continued for several yards, perfectly spaced, before vanishing abruptly near the black rocks that framed the northern edge of the beach. There were no returning prints. No signs of struggle. No indication of where the stranger had gone. She scanned the empty coast, but there was only mist, sea, and silence. Unease prickled beneath her skin, though curiosity quickly followed. The locals at the village pub were polite but evasive when she mentioned the footprints. An old fisherman named Bram merely tightened his weathered jaw and muttered that some paths were better left unfollowed. Others exchanged glances heavy with unspoken knowledge before changing the subject. That night, Eleanor lay awake as rain lashed her windows and wind moaned through the eaves. She could not stop thinking about those prints. There had been something hauntingly deliberate about them, something almost intimate, as though they had been left for her alone. The following dawn, drawn by equal parts dread and fascination, she returned to the beach. Again, the footprints were there. Fresh. Waiting. Her pulse quickened as she followed them carefully this time, tracing each impression until she reached the rocks. Hidden behind a jagged outcrop, she discovered a narrow passage carved into the cliffside. Nearly invisible beneath curtains of ivy and sea spray. Beyond it lay a secluded stretch of sand, untouched and eerily beautiful. In its center stood a man. He faced the ocean, tall and motionless, his dark trousers rolled to his calves, his white shirt billowing faintly in the wind. Eleanor stopped, unable to explain the sudden heat rising in her chest despite the cold air. Slowly, he turned. His face was striking, angular and pale, with storm-gray eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. His gaze fixed on hers not with surprise, but recognition. As though he had been expecting her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying easily over the surf. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she did not retreat. "Neither should you," she replied. A faint, enigmatic smile touched his lips, though it held no warmth. Perhaps. For a moment, neither moved. The crashing waves seemed distant compared to the electric silence between them. Then he stepped backward. 1 pace. 2. And without breaking eye contact, he disappeared into the dense veil of sea mist. Eleanor ran forward, her breath sharp with disbelief, but when she reached the spot, there was no one. Only more footprints, leading straight into the churning sea. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the surf, her boots soaked by the icy tide as she stared at the final footprint dissolving beneath the foamy water. Her breath came shallow and uneven. The man had vanished as completely as if the sea itself had claimed him. She searched frantically along the shoreline, her eyes scanning the rocks, the cliffs, the endless gray horizon, but there was no trace of him. Only the rhythmic thunder of waves and the sharp sting of salt on the wind remained. She told herself there had to be a logical explanation. A hidden path. A crevice in the rocks. Some trick of the mist. Yet deep within her, logic had already begun to surrender to something far older and more dangerous. Intrigue. She returned to her cottage that morning unable to settle her thoughts. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every gust rattling the windows seemed charged with a strange expectancy. She found herself standing at the bedroom window for hours, watching the beach below, half hoping and half fearing she would see him again. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it brought dreams unlike any she had ever known. She dreamed of moonlit water, black and glistening, and of bare footsteps appearing one by one across silver sand. In the dream, she followed them until she found him standing beneath the cliffs. His gray eyes were softer then, though no less unsettling. And his cool fingers brushed hers with a touch so vivid Eleanor awoke gasping, her skin burning where no hand had truly been. The next morning, despite every sensible instinct urging otherwise, she returned to the hidden cove. The footprints were waiting once more. This time, she followed them without hesitation. He was there again, seated upon a dark stone near the tide, as though carved from the very landscape. His shirt clung damply to his body, revealing the powerful lines beneath, while droplets of seawater glimmered on his skin like scattered diamonds. He looked up as she approached, and again there was that unnerving absence of surprise. "You came back," he said. Eleanor folded her arms, masking her unease with defiance. "I could say the same." A shadow of amusement flickered across his face. Curiosity can be perilous. So can mystery. For the first time, his smile reached his eyes, though it only deepened their dangerous allure. "Then perhaps we are equally reckless." He introduced himself simply as Adrian, offering no surname. When she asked if he lived nearby, his answer was maddeningly vague. In a manner of speaking. Yet despite his evasiveness, Eleanor found herself drawn to him with an intensity that unsettled her. There was an undeniable magnetism in his presence, a quiet sensuality woven through every glance and word. He spoke with intelligence and melancholy, as though burdened by memories too vast to share. Hours seemed to slip away as they talked, though Adrian revealed little of himself while somehow learning much about her. Her failed marriage. Her loneliness. The restless dissatisfaction that had brought her to Blackthorn Cove. It was as though he could see through every carefully constructed defense she possessed. Over the following days, their meetings became an unspoken ritual. Always at dawn. Always guided by those impossible footprints. With each encounter, the tension between them grew, simmering beneath conversation like an approaching storm. Eleanor began to notice details that both fascinated and disturbed her. His skin was always cool to the touch, even beneath the sun. No one in town ever mentioned him. And though she sometimes arrived unexpectedly early, Adrian was always already there, as though he emerged from the sea itself. One evening, unable to resist further, Eleanor visited the village archives, an ancient room tucked behind the local church. Dust-covered records and yellowed newspapers revealed fragments of Blackthorn Cove's darker history. Shipwrecks. Disappearances. Legends whispered over generations of a figure seen walking the shore before storms, leaving footprints in the sand. A man described exactly as Adrian. Her blood ran cold as she studied a sketch from over a century ago. The face staring back at her was unmistakable. It was him. Unchanged. Untouched by time. That night, a violent storm rolled over the coast, shaking her cottage with feral intensity. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the beach below in ghostly flashes. And there, through rain and darkness, Eleanor saw them. Fresh footprints forming in the sand outside her home, leading directly to her door. The thunder cracked so violently it rattled the cottage walls, but Eleanor barely flinched. She stood motionless in the narrow hallway, candle trembling in her hand, her gaze fixed upon the dark outline visible beneath the frosted glass of her front door. Her pulse hammered so fiercely it seemed louder than the storm itself. The footprints she had seen from the window had not vanished with the tide. They had crossed the dunes, climbed the path, reached her threshold. Another flash of lightning illuminated the figure outside. Tall. Still. Waiting. Adrian. For one suspended moment, reason urged her to remain silent, to retreat, to lock herself away from whatever impossible force had entered her life. But something deeper, more primal, overpowered fear. Eleanor opened the door. Wind and rain surged inward, carrying the scent of salt and storm. Adrian stood before her, drenched but eerily composed, his dark hair slicked back, his pale face glistening with rainwater. His gray eyes held an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said softly. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the candleholder. "You came." His gaze lowered briefly, not in shame, but in something heavier. Hunger. "I tried not to." The confession sent an unexpected heat through her despite the cold. She stepped aside before fully understanding why. Adrian entered without another word. The air seemed to shift around him, as though the storm itself had followed him inside. Candlelight flickered across his sharp features, casting shadows that made him appear both breathtaking and dangerous. Eleanor closed the door, suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of the small cottage, of the silence between thunderclaps, of her own ragged breathing. "What are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's jaw tightened. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. "That is not a simple answer." "Then give me the complicated one." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether truth would destroy something fragile between them. "I was once a man," he said at last. "Long ago. Before the sea took me." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. "Took you?" Adrian moved closer, his wet clothes clinging to the powerful contours of his body, though his presence was less threatening than intoxicating. "In 1860, the ship I commanded wrecked upon these cliffs during a winter storm. Every soul aboard perished." His voice was calm, but threaded with ancient pain. "Including me." Eleanor's breath caught. "That's impossible." And yet. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face with spectral brilliance. Some deaths are not endings. Some are bargains. She stared at him, torn between disbelief and the undeniable reality standing before her. A bargain with what? Adrian's eyes darkened. With the sea. With whatever ancient force lingers beneath it. Silence stretched. The storm battered the house like a living thing. Eleanor should have recoiled. Should have dismissed him as mad or fled in terror. But every instinct betrayed her. Instead, she stepped closer. Why me? Adrian's expression shifted, revealing vulnerability more frightening than his mystery. Because you found me. His fingertips brushed her wrist, cool and featherlight, yet the contact sent fire racing through her body. And because after all these years, you are the first who has made me wish to be more than what I've become. Eleanor's heart pounded. His touch, his voice, his very existence defied understanding, yet awakened desires she had buried long before arriving at Blackthorn Cove. The storm outside became irrelevant. There was only him. This is dangerous, she whispered. Yes. But neither moved away. Adrian's hand rose slowly to her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle for something born of shipwrecks and shadows. His eyes searched hers, offering warning even as his nearness promised ruin. If you ask me to leave, I will. Eleanor knew she should. Knew every rational part of her life depended upon that choice. But rationality had long since eroded like cliffs beneath relentless waves. Stay, she breathed. The kiss was unlike anything she had ever known. Cold and heat. Hunger and restraint. It was as though centuries of loneliness had poured into a single moment of aching intimacy. Adrian kissed her not as a predator, but as a man starved for something he no longer believed himself capable of possessing. Yet beneath his tenderness was an undercurrent of peril, a darkness vast as the ocean itself. When they finally parted, Eleanor's knees weakened, her body trembling not from fear, but awakening. Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. You cannot yet comprehend what this choice may cost. Eleanor met his gaze, breathless and unflinching. Then show me. Outside, the storm raged on. But far below the cliffs, something ancient stirred beneath the waves. And for the first time in over a century, it had begun to notice her too. Morning arrived pale and uneasy, as though the sun itself feared fully rising over Blackthorn Cove. Eleanor awoke tangled in linen sheets, the remnants of storm and passion lingering in the salt-heavy air. For a fleeting, disorienting moment, she wondered if the night had been some fevered dream born from isolation and longing. But the cool indentation beside her in bed, the faint scent of sea spray upon her skin, and the damp footprints fading across the wooden floor toward the door told another story entirely. Adrian was gone. She sat upright, her fingers brushing her lips where his kiss still seemed imprinted, her body alive with memory and unanswered questions. Yet beneath that aching exhilaration, something darker had rooted itself. The storm had not simply passed. It had left behind an oppressive stillness, as though the sea was holding its breath. Determined to reclaim clarity, Eleanor spent the day in the village, though Blackthorn Cove offered little comfort. The townspeople seemed unusually tense. Conversations ceased when she entered shops. Curtains twitched. Eyes lingered too long. At the harbor, Old Bram intercepted her before she could retreat. His weathered face was graver than ever. "You've been seeing him," he said, not as a question but an accusation. Eleanor stiffened. "You know about Adrian." Bram's silence confirmed more than words could. He glanced toward the sea. His expression shadowed by fear and old grief. "Every generation, someone does. And it never ends well." Eleanor crossed her arms, unwilling to surrender to superstition. "He's not what you think." Bram's gaze hardened. "No, lass. He's exactly what I think. The sea gives nothing without taking more in return." His words clung to her long after she left him standing on the docks, gulls shrieking overhead like warnings. That evening, unable to resist the pull between dread and desire, Eleanor returned to the hidden cove. Adrian was waiting near the rocks, his silhouette framed by the dying gold of sunset. Yet something was different. His posture was taut. His expression burdened. "You spoke to Bram," he said quietly. Eleanor frowned. "How did you know?" A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "This town has feared me longer than it has feared storms." She approached him carefully. "Then tell me the truth." "All of it." Adrian's eyes drifted to the waves, their endless motion reflecting the torment beneath his composed exterior. "When I drowned, I should have been lost. But something ancient answered my desperation. It bound me to this shore. I endure, but at a cost." "What cost?" He turned toward her then, and the sorrow in his face struck deeper than fear. "Souls." Eleanor's breath faltered. "No. Not by choice," he said sharply, anguish threading his voice. "Storms come. Ships wreck. The sea feeds. And I remain." The implications were monstrous, yet Adrian's pain was undeniable. He was not a villain reveling in ruin, but a prisoner chained to an unspeakable cycle. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered. "Because you matter." The confession hung between them, raw and devastating. "And because the bond between us has awakened something dangerous." As if summoned by his words, the ocean shifted violently. Waves crashed harder against the cliffs. The wind sharpened. Eleanor turned toward the water and saw, just beneath the darkening surface, shapes moving. Human shapes. Countless pale figures drifting below like drowned ghosts stirred from centuries of slumber. She gasped, stumbling back. "Adrian." His hand gripped hers, firm but cold. "They know you now." Panic flared. "Who are they?" "The others. Those the sea has claimed through me." The spectral forms churned beneath the waves, writhing with unnatural awareness. Eleanor felt their hunger like icy fingers brushing her mind. "You must leave Blackthorn Cove," Adrian said, urgency overtaking every word. "Tonight." "I'm not leaving you." His expression fractured, desire and despair colliding. "Eleanor, you do not understand. The sea is jealous. It does not release what it touches." She shook her head, even as terror clawed at her reason. "Then we fight it." Adrian stared at her. As though hope itself was more terrifying than damnation. Slowly, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a lingering kiss against her knuckles. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known." Before Eleanor could answer, the sea erupted. A monstrous wave crashed against the shore with explosive force, and from its black depths rose a figure neither living nor dead. A woman, draped in seaweed and ruin, her hollow eyes fixed upon Eleanor with ancient fury. Her voice echoed like drowning whispers. "He was promised." Adrian stepped in front of Eleanor instantly, his entire form radiating protective ferocity. "Run!" But Eleanor could not move. Because as the sea-born spectre lifted one skeletal hand toward her, Eleanor felt something impossible stir within herself. A memory not her own. A ship. A storm. A life once lost to these same waters. And suddenly, horrifyingly, she understood. This was not her first time standing upon this cursed shore. The world seemed to fracture beneath Eleanor's feet as visions flooded her mind with merciless clarity. They came not as distant impressions, but as living memories. Salt choking her lungs. Velvet skirts drenched with seawater. The violent pitch of a sinking ship beneath a blood-red sky. She saw herself, though not herself as she was now. Another name. Another century. Dark hair plastered to pale cheeks. A silver locket pressed desperately to her throat. And Adrian, younger in mortal form yet unmistakable, reaching for her through crashing waves as the ocean tore them apart. Eleanor collapsed to her knees on the wet sand, gasping as the force of remembrance consumed her. "No," she whispered, though truth surged through every shattered piece of her. Adrian turned toward her, horror and heartbreak written across his face. "Eleanor." The sea wraith's hollow laughter pierced the storm. She remembers. Her ruined form hovered above the surf, draped in spectral tatters, her voice layered with the anguish of countless dead. The promised bride returns. Eleanor's hands trembled as fragments aligned into devastating understanding. In 1860, she had not been a stranger to Adrian. She had been Isolde Vane, the fiancée he had intended to marry upon returning from sea. She had boarded his vessel in secret, desperate to surprise him. Instead, both had been claimed by the wreck. Adrian had bargained for survival, but the sea, ancient and cruel, had twisted his plea. It preserved him while taking her. Or so he had believed. "You died," Adrian said, his voice raw with disbelief. "I searched for you for decades." Eleanor rose unsteadily, tears mingling with rain as ancient grief bled into present longing. "I did die." Her voice shook. "But somehow, I came back." The wraith shrieked, her fury shaking the waves. Reborn flesh cannot sever the covenant. She belongs to the depths. Adrian stepped forward, his body radiating a power Eleanor had only begun to comprehend. "No." The single word reverberated like thunder. The sea answered violently. Waves surged upward in towering walls. Ghostly hands reaching from the water with desperate hunger. The air thickened with voices of the drowned. Eleanor felt them clawing at her consciousness, urging surrender. Memories continued to surface in brutal flashes. A secret vow exchanged with Adrian before his final voyage. A promise that neither life nor death would part them. And beneath it all, the horrifying realization that the sea's bargain had not merely cursed Adrian. It had bound their souls together across lifetimes. She had returned because the covenant remained unfinished. What does it want? Eleanor cried over the chaos. Adrian's face darkened with ancient understanding. Completion. Bram's warnings. The town's fear, the endless footprints, they had all led here. The sea had waited not for random sacrifice, but for reunion. For Eleanor's soul to willingly rejoin Adrian in death, sealing the bargain permanently. Or for Adrian to surrender his immortality and return to the depths. One soul for another. Love twisted into ransom. There must be another way, Eleanor said desperately. Adrian's expression broke her heart. There may not be. The wraith advanced, skeletal fingers outstretched. Choose. Eleanor's pulse thundered. Fear warred with love, but beneath both rose something stronger. Defiance. She was no passive offering. Not in this life. Not in any life. No, she said, standing fully despite the storm's fury. I choose neither. The sea seemed to recoil. Adrian stared at her. Eleanor. But she was already moving, driven by instinct older than memory. Her fingers closed around the silver locket now inexplicably hanging at her throat, the same one from her former life. It pulsed with warmth. Inside was not merely a portrait, but an inscription. Words Adrian had once given her. Beyond tide and death, our souls remain our own. The vow was not surrender. It was protection. A promise of freedom beyond possession. Eleanor raised the locket high. You cannot own what was never yours. She cried into the storm. Light erupted from the silver. Brilliant and searing. The sea wraith screamed as the force shattered through spectral darkness. Waves convulsed. The ghostly figures beneath the surface writhed and dissolved into silver mist. The covenant, built upon stolen love and corrupted grief, began to fracture. Adrian staggered as though chains unseen were tearing from his very being. Eleanor. She reached for him as the sea exploded around them, ancient power unraveling. For one terrifying moment, Adrian's body began to dissolve into shimmering spray. His curse was breaking. But so too, perhaps, was his existence. Eleanor seized his face between her hands, her tears fierce with refusal. Find me, she whispered. In every life. Adrian's storm-gray eyes softened with profound, eternal devotion. Always. Then the sea consumed them both. Silence followed. Blackthorn Cove awoke the next morning beneath calm skies for the first time in living memory. The storms had ceased. The unnatural footprints were gone. The hidden cove stood empty. And on the shore, unconscious but alive, Eleanor was found alone. With no sign Adrian had ever existed. Except for the damp silver locket clasped tightly in her hand. And the fresh set of bare footprints beside her, leading not into the sea, but away from it. Eleanor awoke to warmth. Real warmth. Sunlight spilled gently across her face, golden and soft, carrying none of the cold salt-haunted dread that had defined Blackthorn Cove since her arrival. For several fragile moments, She lay still in unfamiliar stillness, listening not to storms or spectral whispers, but to birdsong drifting through open curtains. The scent of sea remained, but lighter now. Cleaner. As though some ancient corruption had finally been washed away. She was in her cottage bed, though she had no memory of returning. Villagers had found her at dawn, Bram explained later, unconscious near the cliffs yet physically unharmed. He sat beside her window as she regained strength. His weathered face gentler than she had ever seen. "The sea is quiet," he said simply. "Hasn't been quiet like this for over 100 years. Eleanor's fingers instinctively closed around the silver locket still resting against her skin. It had not left her since that night. The metal was warm now, no longer carrying the supernatural pulse it once had, but the inscription remained. "Beyond tide and death, our souls remain our own." She asked Bram if anyone else had been found. Any man. Any sign at all. But his silence gave her the answer before words could. "No," he said softly. "Only you." Grief settled over her, not as violent despair, but as an aching hollow too deep for tears. Adrian was gone. Whether destroyed, freed, or reborn into some unknowable fate, she could not say. Only that his absence was vast. Yet beneath that pain, something quieter endured. A certainty she could neither explain nor deny. He had promised. Always. Days passed. Blackthorn Cove transformed before Eleanor's eyes. The villagers' guarded fear slowly dissolved into cautious peace. Fishing boats returned to waters once cursed. Children played upon beaches long avoided. The oppressive fog lifted more often, revealing brighter horizons. It was as though the town itself had been released from a collective nightmare. And still, Eleanor remained. Though logic urged her to leave. To return to London and reclaim the fragments of her former life, she found herself unable to abandon the shore where lifetimes had converged. She rented the cottage indefinitely. She walked the beach each morning, sometimes with hope, sometimes only memory. But the mysterious footprints never returned. Until the 13th day. Dawn had barely broken when Eleanor saw them. Bare prints in wet sand. Fresh. Distinct. Her breath caught so sharply it hurt. They began where the tide receded and stretched northward, not toward the hidden cove, but into the dense pine woods beyond the cliffs. Her heart pounded with impossible hope as she followed them. The forest was thick with mist and birdsong. Ancient roots twisting beneath her boots. The tracks continued deeper until, at last, they ended at the edge of a secluded freshwater lake Eleanor had never before discovered. And there, kneeling at the shore as though awakening from centuries of sleep, was a man. He was bare-chested, water glistening across powerful shoulders, dark hair tousled by morning breeze. Eleanor froze, unable to breathe. Adrian looked up. But something was different. His storm-gray eyes remained, unmistakable and devastating, yet stripped now of their endless burden. No spectral weight. No ancient sorrow. He looked human. Alive. Confused, perhaps, but alive. "I know you," he said, his voice hoarse. As though language itself were newly remembered. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. "Yes." He rose slowly, studying her face with growing wonder. I don't understand how. Eleanor approached carefully, her entire soul trembling. You will. Adrian touched his own chest, as if startled by the rhythm of his heartbeat. I was drowning. You were being reborn. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, as recognition transcended fractured memory, Adrian crossed the final distance and pulled her into his arms. Warm. Solid. Mortal. Eleanor wept against him, overwhelmed not merely by reunion, but by liberation. The curse was broken. The sea had not claimed him. It had released him. Their kiss beneath the whispering pines was not the desperate hunger of stolen moments, but something deeper. A culmination. A beginning reclaimed from centuries of loss. Yet peace, Eleanor would soon discover, was not the same as simplicity. Adrian remembered fragments. Dreams of ships, storms, and endless tides. But he was no longer the immortal being shaped by dark bargains. He was a man once more, navigating a modern world he scarcely understood. And though the sea's ancient grip had loosened, some shadows did not vanish so easily. That evening, as they sat together on the cottage porch beneath a sky painted in stars, Eleanor noticed movement far beyond the moonlit waves. A distant feminine silhouette standing upon the water. Watching. The sea wraith, diminished but not destroyed. Her hollow eyes gleamed with warning before she dissolved into mist. Adrian followed Eleanor's gaze, his expression darkening. It's not over, he murmured. Eleanor laced her fingers through his, steady and resolute. Then this time, we finish it together. Far out at sea, thunder rumbled on an otherwise clear horizon. And somewhere in the depths, something ancient had begun to stir once more. The days that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had imagined possible. For the first time, Adrian existed not as a phantom bound to cursed shores, but as a living man navigating sunlight, touch, and time itself. He marveled at simple things with an intensity that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The warmth of coffee between his palms. The softness of cotton sheets. Music drifting from an old radio in Eleanor's cottage. Each experience seemed precious, as though mortality itself had become a gift he had once forgotten how to desire. Yet beneath these tender discoveries lingered an unspoken tension. Adrian's freedom had come at a price neither fully understood. He remembered enough of his former existence to know the sea's bargains were never cleanly broken. Some debts echoed. Some forces waited. Eleanor saw it in the way his expression darkened whenever storms gathered at the horizon, or how his body tensed when waves crashed too violently against the cliffs. He was free, yes. But freedom did not mean immunity. One evening, as twilight painted Blackthorn Cove in bruised purples and silver, Bram visited the cottage carrying an ancient leather-bound journal recovered from the church archives. Found this hidden in the old rector's chambers, he said grimly. Thought you both should see it. The journal belonged to Father Aldous, a priest who had served the village during the 1860 wreck. Its brittle pages detailed not only Adrian's doomed voyage, but older horrors stretching back centuries. Blackthorn Cove had long been a place of sacrifice. A fissure between worlds. The sea surrounding it was not merely dangerous water, but a threshold inhabited by an entity known in fragmented folklore as the Drowned Mother. Neither goddess nor ghost, but something primordial. She fed upon longing, grief, and devotion, weaving bargains from desperation. Every generation, she marked chosen souls, binding them through tragedy to strengthen her hold on the mortal shore. Adrian had never been her only servant. Merely her most enduring one. Eleanor read in horrified silence as the truth emerged. The sea wraith they had encountered was not the true architect of the curse, but one of many drowned brides, women claimed and corrupted into spectral guardians. Isolde, Eleanor's former self, had been intended as the next. Her reincarnation had disrupted the cycle, but not destroyed its source. "She'll come for you both," Bram said quietly. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Then let her." But Father Aldous' final entries offered a chilling warning. The drowned mother could only be permanently severed if the bonded souls she marked willingly entered her domain and shattered her heart at its source, deep beneath Blackthorn Reef. Few had tried. None had returned. Eleanor met Adrian's gaze, fear and certainty intertwining. "We have to end this." Adrian's expression was immediate and fierce. "No. Adrian, I will not lose you again." His voice cracked with centuries of buried pain. "Not for any curse." Eleanor stepped closer, cupping his face with unwavering tenderness. "And I won't spend another lifetime running from what we are." The silence that followed was agonizing. Finally, Adrian closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as though she were the only anchor left in existence. "Then we face it together," he whispered. Preparations began swiftly. Bram enlisted the help of Maeve, the village's reclusive herbalist and descendant of old coastal mystics. Maeve was sharp-eyed and unsettlingly perceptive, a woman who spoke of spirits as casually as weather. She crafted protective sigils from salt, silver, and bone, warning them that mortal weapons would be useless beneath the reef. "This battle is not of flesh," she said, fastening a black cord around Eleanor's wrist. "It is of will. Of memory. She will tempt you with everything you have lost." On the night of the new moon, Eleanor and Adrian stood once more upon the hidden cove where their fates had first reawakened. The sea was unnaturally calm, black as polished obsidian. Bram prepared a small boat, his weathered hands uncharacteristically unsteady. "If the tide turns red," he said, "I'll know." Eleanor embraced him tightly. "Thank you." Adrian said little. His focus remained fixed upon the horizon, where distant mist writhed like living breath. As they rowed toward Blackthorn Reef, the world seemed to shift around them. Fog swallowed the shore. Stars vanished. The water beneath them grew luminous, revealing ghostly figures drifting below. Dozens. Hundreds. Faces twisted in longing and despair. Drowned souls bound to the ancient force waiting beneath. Then the sea parted. Before them rose a jagged cathedral of black stone and coral, impossibly vast beneath moonless skies. At its center pulsed a monstrous heart of bioluminescent flesh, suspended within spiraling ruins. And from the depths emerged the drowned mother. Towering and terrible, her form was a grotesque fusion of woman, ocean, and abyss. Her voice was every storm, every whisper, every grief ever surrendered to the waves. "Beloved children," she crooned. "You return to me. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled beneath the force of her presence, but Adrian's hand gripped hers with unshakable resolve. "No," he said, his mortal voice carrying immortal defiance. "We return to end you." The sea erupted. And together, hand in hand, they stepped into the abyss. The descent into the abyss felt less like drowning and more like entering memory itself. Water enveloped Eleanor and Adrian, yet they did not suffocate. Maeve's sigils burned silver against their skin, surrounding them in a fragile cocoon of ancient protection as they were pulled downward through black depths illuminated by spectral blue fire. Around them drifted shattered remnants of forgotten ships, broken masts entwined with coral, rusted anchors wrapped in skeletal hands, entire centuries of ruin suspended in silence. But the deeper they sank, the more reality unraveled. Time bent. Eleanor saw reflections not in water, but in currents of memory. Faces from lives she had lived. Women standing on distant shores. Women aboard storm-torn vessels. Women bound by love and loss, all carrying fragments of her soul, all marked by the drowned mother's insatiable hunger. Adrian saw them too. The countless iterations of himself. Sailors. Fishermen. Lovers. Men broken and reshaped by grief into instruments of the sea's will. "She's showing us the chain," Eleanor whispered, though her voice seemed to ripple directly into Adrian's thoughts. "Every cycle." His hand tightened around hers. "Then we break all of them." At last, they reached the sunken cathedral. The structure was vast beyond reason, carved from obsidian reef and adorned with impossible symbols that shifted when viewed too closely. At its center pulsed the heart of the deep, a colossal organ-like mass radiating crimson and blue light, each beat sending tremors through water and spirit alike. It was horrifying and mesmerizing, alive with stolen devotion. Bound to it by tendrils of seaweed, bone, and spectral force were the drowned brides, dozens of women transformed into guardians through centuries of sacrifice. Their hollow eyes opened in eerie unison as Eleanor approached. The drowned mother's towering form coiled around the cathedral, her beauty monstrous, her face both maternal and ruinous. Her voice slithered through their minds like velvet over knives. "Why resist what you have always been?" Instantly, the cathedral transformed around them. Eleanor gasped as she found herself standing not underwater, but in an elegant Victorian manor bathed in candlelight. Adrian stood beside her, dressed in formal black, alive and smiling, untouched by curse or tragedy. Music swelled. Guests laughed. A perfect wedding. The life stolen from them. "This can be yours," the drowned mother purred. "No storms. No suffering. Only the eternity you were denied." Adrian's expression flickered. For one dangerous moment, Eleanor saw his resolve waver. The temptation was exquisite. Not false in appearance, but false in foundation. A cage gilded in fulfilled longing. Eleanor stepped back, tears burning her eyes. "It isn't real." The illusion sharpened, pressing harder. Children's laughter echoed. Warmth. Home. Peace. Everything they had lost across lifetimes offered with devastating precision. Adrian reached for her, his storm-gray eyes filled with unbearable yearning. "Eleanor." She saw his pain, his desire, his exhaustion. And with heartbreaking clarity, she understood the true cruelty of the drowned mother. Not destruction. Seduction. The weaponization of love itself. Eleanor took Adrian's face in her hands. "Look at me." His gaze steadied. "I would rather have one real lifetime with you," she whispered fiercely, "than an eternity built on lies." The illusion shattered like glass beneath thunder. The cathedral returned in violent fury. The drowned mother screamed, her rage splitting the water into chaotic whirlpools. Then drown with truth. The drowned bride surged forward, shrieking as they attacked. But Eleanor no longer saw monsters. She saw prisoners. Women like herself. Bound by stolen choice. Clutching the silver locket, Eleanor raised it toward the heart of the deep. "Your souls were never hers." Light erupted. Not merely from the locket, but from every buried memory of love uncorrupted by possession. Across the cathedral, the drowned brides began to change. Hollow eyes filled with awareness. Chains of spectral seaweed shattered. One by one, their agonized forms softened into peace before dissolving into radiant currents that ascended toward freedom. The drowned mother convulsed in fury and fear. "No." Adrian seized a fallen obsidian shard, now glowing with liberated energy, and plunged it directly into the heart of the deep. The effect was cataclysmic. The heart ruptured with blinding force, releasing an explosion of ancient grief, rage, and stolen devotion. The cathedral collapsed. Black reef shattered. The drowned mother let out a final, deafening cry, not of hatred, but of unbearable loneliness, as her colossal form disintegrated into salt and shadow. The ocean itself seemed to exhale. But victory came at terrible cost. The protective sigils were failing. Water pressure intensified. The abyss began to consume everything. Adrian grabbed Eleanor, pulling her upward as the ruins imploded around them. Yet dark currents seized him, remnants of the collapsing curse dragging him back. "No!" Eleanor screamed, clutching him desperately. Adrian's face was calm despite the chaos. "You know how this ends." "Not again." Tears streamed into the sea itself. "I won't lose you." Adrian pressed one final kiss to her lips, filled with every promise they had ever made. "You never will." With his remaining strength, he tore himself free from her grasp and forced Eleanor toward the rising light above. She ascended screaming his name as darkness swallowed him below. Then everything vanished. Eleanor awoke alone upon the shore once more. But this time, the sea was silent. Entirely. No whispers. No storms. No footprints. Only peace. And in her hand rested Adrian's silver ring, warm beneath the morning sun. Yet far out on the horizon, where sea met sky, a solitary figure walked calmly across the water toward land. For a long while, Eleanor could not move. She lay upon the wet sand beneath a sky so startlingly blue it seemed impossible that such horror had ever existed beneath it. Every muscle in her body trembled with exhaustion, grief, and disbelief. The tide lapped gently at her feet, no longer ravenous, no longer haunted. Blackthorn Cove had transformed into something almost sacred in its stillness. Yet Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon where she had seen that solitary figure. At first, she feared it was only another cruel mirage, some lingering echo of the abyss designed to torment her fragile hope. But as the figure drew nearer, emerging through silver mist with deliberate human steps, her breath caught. Adrian. Not spectral. Not cursed. Alive. He walked not upon storm or darkness now, but through shallow morning surf like any mortal man returning home. His white shirt clung to his body, his dark hair stirred by sea breeze, and though his face bore the gravity of all they had endured, his storm-gray eyes were free. Entirely free. Eleanor rose unsteadily, her tears blurring the world as she ran toward him. This time there was no hesitation, no fear of vanishing. Adrian met her with equal urgency, catching her as though she were both salvation and certainty itself. Their kiss was fierce, desperate, and gloriously real. Not the stolen intimacy of cursed encounters. Not the tragic collision of doomed souls. But reunion. Earned and unbroken. You came back, Eleanor whispered against him, her voice fractured by overwhelming relief. Adrian touched her cheek with reverent tenderness. I told you, he said softly. Always. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn Cove became a place reborn. News spread quietly through the village that the storms had ceased for good. Fishing routes once feared became safe. The hidden cove, though still beautiful, no longer carried the oppressive weight of old sorrow. Bram, ever skeptical of miracles, merely grunted when Adrian reappeared, though Eleanor caught the unmistakable glimmer of emotion in the old fisherman's eyes. Took you long enough, he muttered. Maeve, however, offered a knowing smile. Some souls, she said, are too stubborn for death to keep. Adrian's return was not without complexity. Though fully human, he retained fragmented memories spanning lifetimes. He struggled at times with modern customs, with language shifts, with the quiet psychological scars of centuries spent bound to darkness. Yet Eleanor never saw these as burdens. They were simply pieces of him. And for the first time, he had the freedom to heal. Together, they built something neither had ever truly possessed. A life. Simple, perhaps, by comparison to curses and reincarnation, but infinitely more profound. Morning walks along peaceful beaches. Candlelit dinners. Laughter untainted by looming tragedy. Nights where Adrian no longer vanished with storms, but remained beside her, warm and breathing, his heartbeat a miracle Eleanor never ceased cherishing. Yet peace did not erase mystery entirely. One autumn evening, while restoring portions of the old cottage, Eleanor discovered a hidden compartment beneath loose floorboards. Inside lay letters. Dozens of them. All written in Adrian's hand across different centuries. Each addressed not merely to Isolde, but to Eleanor herself, though by many names she had borne in countless lives. In every era, he had searched for her. Waited for her. Loved her. The letters chronicled reincarnations he had glimpsed but could never fully reach. A woman in 1920s Paris. A nurse during wartime England. A painter in Florence. Always her. Always almost. Eleanor wept as she read them, overwhelmed by the staggering depth of a devotion that had transcended death, memory, and damnation. You never stopped, she whispered that night. Adrian held her beneath starlight, his voice quiet but unwavering. I couldn't. She looked at him then not as a ghost, sailor, or cursed legend, but as the singular soul who had found her across eternity. What happens now? Adrian smiled, softer than she had ever seen. Now. We live. And so they did. Seasons passed. Blackthorn Cove flourished. Eleanor eventually transformed the weather-worn cottage into a seaside inn, a sanctuary for weary travelers seeking healing rather than escape. Adrian, with his uncanny understanding of sea and storm, became both protector and guide for local fishermen. Together, they became something of a quiet legend, not feared, but revered. Yet every so often, at dawn, Eleanor would glance upon the sand and find a single set of bare footprints stretching briefly along the shore before disappearing into sunlight. Never ominous. Never sorrowful. Merely a reminder. Love had walked here. Love had endured. On the first anniversary of the sea's silence, Adrian led Eleanor to the hidden cove where their impossible journey had begun. There, beneath moonlight and whispering tides, he knelt in the sand and offered her not a bargain, not a curse, but a simple ring forged from silver and black pearl. In this life, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and every one after, should fate dare challenge me again. Will you choose me? Eleanor smiled through tears, her answer as eternal as the waves themselves. Always. As they embraced, the ocean shimmered gently beneath moonlight, peaceful at last. And somewhere deep within its infinite blue, the last remnants of darkness dissolved into nothing, leaving behind only footprints on the beach. Years unfolded with a grace neither Eleanor nor Adrian had ever dared imagine during the long centuries of loss that had preceded them. Blackthorn Cove, once shadowed by shipwrecks, curses, and whispered fears, became a haven of warmth and quiet wonder. Travelers arrived not in search of ghosts, but for healing. The inn Eleanor built flourished, its sea-worn walls transformed into a sanctuary filled with laughter, candlelight, and the scent of fresh bread drifting through open windows. Guests often remarked upon the peculiar peace that seemed to saturate the shore, as though the very land had exhaled after generations of sorrow. Few knew how literal that truth was. Eleanor and Adrian carried their extraordinary history privately. Not from shame, but from reverence. Their love no longer needed spectacle. It lived instead in everyday tenderness. In shared glances over morning tea. In fingers brushing while walking the beach at sunrise. In evenings spent before crackling fires as storms passed harmlessly overhead, no longer predators but simple weather. Adrian adapted slowly yet beautifully to mortality. He embraced every fragile, fleeting aspect of human life with profound gratitude. Birthdays. Music. Books. Imperfect gardens. He often said the brevity of mortal existence was what made it sacred. And Eleanor, who had once arrived at Blackthorn Cove seeking escape from heartbreak, discovered instead a life so full it often brought her to tears. They married in the hidden cove where fate had first reunited them. The ceremony was intimate. Bram stood proudly beside Adrian, gruff and emotional despite his efforts otherwise. Maeve officiated beneath moonlit skies, her ancient blessings mingling with the gentle hush of waves. Eleanor wore no elaborate gown, only simple ivory silk, her silver locket resting over her heart. Adrian's vows were brief, but they carried the weight of lifetimes. "I have loved you in storm," he said, his voice unsteady with emotion. "In death. In darkness. And now, at last, in peace." Eleanor's tears shone brighter than the stars above them. "And I will find you," she replied softly, "wherever eternity dares place us." Their kiss was met not by thunder or spectral winds, but by the calm applause of sea and sky finally at harmony. In time, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. They named her Marina. She inherited her mother's fierce spirit and her father's storm-gray eyes, though in her they held only wonder, never sorrow. Watching Adrian cradle their child for the first time shattered whatever remnants remained of his ancient grief. For centuries, he had been denied future. Now he held it in his arms. Parenthood grounded them further in the precious ordinariness they had fought so hard to earn. Yet even as decades passed, certain mysteries remained. Eleanor aged gracefully, silver eventually threading through her dark hair. Adrian, however, aged differently. Slower. Not immortal, but touched by something beyond typical human years. Maeve suggested that though the curse had broken, traces of the sea's magic had transformed rather than vanished. Adrian would live long, though not forever. A gift, not a punishment. And for once, they accepted uncertainty without fear. Because love had already proven stronger than time. When Bram eventually passed, his funeral overlooked the harbor he had guarded all his life. The sea remained calm throughout, as though honoring one of its final true sentinels. Maeve, too, departed years later, leaving behind whispered wisdom and protective traditions that became woven into village life. Blackthorn Cove never forgot its past, but neither was it imprisoned by it. Instead, its legends evolved into stories of endurance, redemption, and extraordinary love. In their old age, Eleanor and Adrian often returned to the hidden cove at dawn. Hand in hand, they would walk barefoot along wet sand, leaving twin trails of footprints behind them. Sometimes Marina and later her own children joined them, laughter replacing the whispers that once haunted those shores. And always, the sea remained gentle. On Eleanor's final morning, many decades after she first arrived at Blackthorn Cove, she awoke in their cottage with sunlight warming her face and Adrian's hand clasped in hers. Age had softened her body, but not her spirit. She looked at him, her beloved constant across lifetimes, and smiled with serene certainty. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. Adrian's eyes, though lined now with mortal years, filled with tears. "Nor am I." She touched his cheek tenderly. "You'll find me again." His voice broke, but his answer remained unchanged through every age. "Always." Eleanor passed peacefully as waves murmured below their window. And though grief came, it was not the savage despair of old curses. It was love's natural ache. Years later, when Adrian's own final day arrived, he walked alone to the hidden cove at dawn. There, he removed his shoes, stepped barefoot into wet sand, and smiled as he saw another set of footprints already waiting beside his own. Smaller. Familiar. He followed them into morning light. The villagers would one day tell stories of how both vanished gently, leaving behind no bodies, only two sets of footprints stretching across the shore before disappearing where sea met sky. Side by side. Forever. And so, Blackthorn Cove's greatest mystery was no longer one of death or darkness, but of love so enduring it transcended storm, sea, and time itself. If one walks that beach at sunrise even now, when mist clings low and the tide is just right, they may glimpse them. Two figures in the distance, hand in hand, leaving footprints on the beach.